came out
Yes.
as a debutante in what year?
What a very tactless question. At 30s. In the 30s.
She was the most photographed woman in Britain, draped in pearls and wrapped in privilege. Then a locked drawer was opened, and everything came crashing down. This is Diamonds, Scandal, and Betrayal, the downfall of Margaret Campbell. Ethel Margaret Wigham was born on December 1st, 1912, in Newton Mearns, Scotland, the only child of Helen Mann and George Hay Wigham. Her father was a self-made millionaire who had built his fortune as chairman of the Celanese Corporation of Britain and North America, manufacturing artificial silk. Though George's parents were well-connected, they weren't particularly wealthy, so he'd created his success through determination and business acumen. Her mother, Helen, was a complicated woman prone to extreme mood swings and an unhealthy obsession with Margaret's appearance. Margaret spent the first 14 years of her life in New York City, where her father's business was headquartered. She was educated privately at the prestigious Hewitt School, surrounded by the children of America's wealthiest families. As an only child, Margaret was showered with attention from her father, but constantly criticized by her mother. Helen worried obsessively about Margaret's looks, even rationing how much the girl could read for fear it might cause her to need glasses and ruin her beauty. The pressure was relentless. Under her mother's scrutiny, Margaret developed a stammer. She was taken to see Lionel Logue, the speech therapist who would later work with King George VI. The treatment didn't help. Helen also took Margaret to a psychiatrist who diagnosed her with lacking a sense of humor and prescribed watching Charlie Chaplin films. The young girl was treated like a project to be perfected rather than a child to be loved. As Helen once told her, "No matter how pretty you are, Margaret, you will get nowhere in life if you stammer." It's little wonder that Margaret learned to seek affection and validation from men. By the time she was a teenager, her beauty was undeniable. She had striking features, impeccable style, and an awareness of how to use both to her advantage. When she was 15 years old during a holiday on the Isle of Wight in 1928, Margaret became involved with an 18-year-old actor named David Niven. She became pregnant. Her father was furious when he found out. Margaret was rushed into a London nursing home for a secret termination, which was illegal at the time. According to the family cook, Elizabeth Duckworth, all hell broke loose in the Wigham household. In 1930, at age 17, Margaret made her debut in London society and was immediately crowned Debutante of the Year. She was a sensation. Newspapers couldn't get enough of her. She appeared constantly in society columns, photographed at every major event, always perfectly dressed and coiffed. Her signature look began to take shape: 3 strands of pearls around her neck, elegant gowns, and an unmistakable confidence. Margaret's beauty attracted some of the most eligible men in Britain and beyond. She had youthful romances with Prince Ali Khan, whose Muslim faith horrified her parents. She was involved with Glenn Kidston, a married millionaire aviator and sportsman who died in a plane crash. She caught the eye of Max Aitken, the insecure son of newspaper magnate Lord Beaverbrook. She was briefly engaged to Fulk Warwick, a penniless earl. Men fell at her feet, and Margaret enjoyed every moment of the attention. By the time she was 19, she'd already been engaged 4 times. Cole Porter mentioned her in the British version of his hit song, "You're the Top." The original lyrics were adapted by P.G. Wodehouse, who changed 2 lines to include, "You're Mussolini, you're Mrs. Sweeney," a reference to Margaret's married name. She was that famous, that talked about, that admired. She was on every best-dressed list, invited to every party, and photographed constantly. Margaret had become exactly what her mother wanted: perfect on the outside. In 1933, when she was 20 years old, Margaret married Charles Sweeney, an Irish-American stockbroker whose family's fortune had been made in mining during America's Gilded Age. The wedding was spectacular. Margaret wore a Norman Hartnell gown that became famous in its own right. The dress was an elegant creation of satin and lace that set trends across Britain and America. Newspapers covered every detail of the ceremony. Society columns devoted pages to descriptions of the guests, the flowers, the reception. It seemed like a fairy tale match between two beautiful, wealthy young people who had the world at their feet. The reality behind closed doors was far different. Charles Sweeney was controlling and bad-tempered. He wanted a traditional wife who would stay home and manage the household, but Margaret craved the spotlight and the social whirl she'd known before marriage. The marriage was an attempt at domesticity for Margaret, but it came at a terrible cost. Over the course of their 15 years together, Margaret suffered 8 miscarriages and a stillbirth. Each loss was devastating, both physically and emotionally. The doctors of the era couldn't explain why she kept losing pregnancies, and Margaret blamed herself. She did eventually give birth to 2 children who survived: a daughter, Frances, born in 1937, and a son, Brian, born in 1940. Margaret loved her children, but motherhood didn't come naturally to her. She'd never cooked a meal in her life and famously claimed she'd never even boiled a kettle. She employed nannies and staff to handle the daily care of the children while she continued her social life. The strain on the marriage was immense. Charles and Margaret fought constantly about her ambitions, her social life, and rumors of her infidelities. He accused her of caring more about being photographed than about being a wife and mother. She accused him of trying to control her and dim her shine. In 1943, something happened that many people believe changed Margaret forever. She was visiting her chiropodist on Bond Street in London when she stepped into what she thought was an elevator. The door had been left open, but the elevator wasn't there. Margaret fell 40 feet down the lift shaft. She described the fall years later with vivid detail. The only thing that saved her was the lift cable, which broke her fall. She must have grabbed at it desperately because all her fingernails were later found to have been torn off. She landed on her knees and cracked the back of her head against the wall. The head trauma was severe. Margaret was lucky to survive. After the accident, people who knew her said she was different. She'd always been flirtatious and social, but now there was a recklessness to her behavior. Some whispered that the head injury had fundamentally altered her personality. Whether that's true or whether it's simply what people told themselves to explain her increasingly bold behavior is impossible to know. What's certain is that Margaret emerged from the accident even more determined to live life on her own terms. By 1947, Margaret and Charles Sweeney had divorced. Unlike many divorces of the era, theirs was surprisingly amicable. Both were independently wealthy, so there were no bitter fights over money. They remained friends, which was unusual for the time. Margaret kept the Sweeney name professionally for a while and enjoyed the house they'd shared at 48 Upper Grosvenor Street in Mayfair, one of London's most prestigious addresses. The years after her divorce were busy ones. Margaret traveled constantly. She had love affairs with various men, including Ted Rousseau, one of the famous monuments men who worked to recover art stolen by the Nazis. He took her on his investigative trips to Europe. She attended parties, gave dinners, and maintained her position at the center of London's social scene. She'd been engaged to a Lehman Brothers banker, but he broke it off when he met someone else. Margaret was temporarily devastated, but not for long. In 1947, Margaret met Ian Douglas Campbell on a train traveling from Paris to London. It was a chance encounter that would change her life, though not in the way she hoped. Ian was the heir to the Duke of Argyll, chief of Clan Campbell, one of Scotland's largest and most powerful clans. The Campbells had been a force in Scottish history for centuries, with a lineage that stretched back to medieval times. Ian was still married to his second wife, Louise Timpson, but the marriage was falling apart. He needed an escape, and Margaret appeared like a gift. Ian told Margaret stories about his experiences as a prisoner of war during World War II. He painted himself as a wounded hero, a man who'd suffered for his country. What he didn't mention was that the trauma had left him addicted to alcohol, gambling, and prescription drugs. He also failed to mention that he was physically violent and emotionally abusive, qualities his first 2 wives knew all too well. Both of his previous wives had described him as dangerous when drunk, which was often, and financially reckless, which was always. For Margaret, though, Ian represented something irresistible, the chance to become a duchess. She'd been Margaret Wigham, a famous debutante. She'd been Mrs. Sweeney, a wealthy socialite, but being a duchess would elevate her to the aristocracy in a way that no amount of money or beauty could achieve on its own. It would give her a title, a historic castle, and a place in the peerage. Her daughter Frances would be able to say her mother was a duchess. Margaret wanted it badly. She'd spent her whole life trying to be on top, and this seemed like the ultimate achievement. Ian, for his part, needed Margaret's money desperately. Inverary Castle, the seat of the Dukes of Argyll since the 18th century, was crumbling and required expensive repairs. The roof leaked, the plumbing was ancient, and maintaining the vast estate was bleeding money faster than the ducal coffers could replace it. Ian had gambling debts that were mounting by the day and was living far beyond his means as he always had. Margaret's substantial fortune could solve all his problems in one stroke. Before they even married, Ian forged a deed of sale to gain access to some of Margaret's money. It was fraud, plain and simple, and it was not an auspicious beginning for a marriage. On March 22, 1951, Margaret became the third wife of Ian Douglas Campbell, the 11th Duke of Argyll. She was 39 years old and he was 48. The ceremony took place at Caxton Hall in London. Margaret finally had what she'd always wanted. She wrote later in life, "I had wealth, I had good looks. As a young woman, I had been constantly photographed, written about, flattered, admired, included in the 10 best-dressed women in the world list, and mentioned by Cole Porter in the words of his song, 'You're the Top.' The top was what I was supposed to be. I had become a duchess and mistress of a historic castle. My daughter had married a duke. Life was apparently roses all the way." The marriage was troubled from the start. Both Margaret and Ian were serially unfaithful. Neither had any intention of being faithful to the other, though both expected fidelity in return. They didn't trust each other, and with good reason. The atmosphere at Inverary Castle and their London home was poisonous. Ian reportedly wiretapped Margaret's car to try to catch her in an affair. He was obsessed with gathering evidence of her infidelities, perhaps because he was planning for a divorce even then, or perhaps simply because his paranoia had been fueled by years of substance abuse. Margaret, in turn, forged letters to try to convince Ian that his sons from his second marriage, the Marquis of Lorne and Lord Colin Campbell, were illegitimate. It was a vicious attack designed to undermine Ian's heirs and cause him maximum pain. The forgeries were sophisticated enough to cause real damage to family relationships before they were exposed as fake. In one particularly desperate and disturbing scheme, Margaret even attempted to acquire a newborn baby from Poland that she could pass off as Ian's rightful heir, ensuring that her child would inherit the dukedom instead of Ian's sons from his previous marriage. When the friend she asked to help with this bizarre plan refused to participate, the whole scheme collapsed. But the fact that Margaret even considered it showed how far she was willing to go. By the late 1950s, the marriage had deteriorated completely. Ian and Margaret had been estranged for 5 years, living separate lives but still legally married. They sued and countersued each other repeatedly over various grievances. Margaret had been paying substantial bills to maintain Inverary Castle, essentially funding Ian's lifestyle and the upkeep of his ancestral home. The castle was a money pit, and Margaret resented every pound she spent on it. Eventually, she stopped paying. That's when Ian decided he'd had enough. He wanted a divorce, he wanted his freedom, and most of all, he wanted to make Margaret pay for humiliating him and refusing to continue bankrolling his lifestyle. In 1963, while Margaret was in New York, Ian hired a locksmith to break into a locked cupboard at their Mayfair home at 48 Upper Grosvenor Street. What he found inside shocked him and would soon shock the entire nation. The cupboard contained Margaret's private diaries and a collection of Polaroid photographs. The photos showed Margaret naked except for her signature 3-strand pearl necklace. In some of the photos, she was engaged in sexual acts with men whose heads had been cropped out of the frame. The infamous Headless man photos became the centerpiece of one of the most scandalous divorce cases in British history. Ian also compiled a list of 88 men he suspected Margaret had been involved with during their marriage. The list included actors, politicians, aristocrats, and businessmen. Some of the names were outrageous speculation. Many of the men listed were actually gay, though homosexuality was still illegal in Britain at the time, so acknowledging their orientation would have destroyed them. The divorce case began in 1963 and immediately became a media sensation. It was the most expensive divorce case Britain had ever seen up to that point. The legal fees on both sides mounted into staggering sums. Every sordid detail was reported in newspapers across Britain and around the world. The country was transfixed by the scandal unfolding in the courtroom. People who had never cared about the aristocracy suddenly knew every detail of the Duke and Duchess of Argyll's private lives. Ian accused Margaret of infidelity and submitted the Polaroid photographs as evidence. The photos were passed around the courtroom for examination by the judge, lawyers, and court officials. Margaret's most intimate moments, captured in photographs she'd never intended anyone else to see, were put on public display. It was a violation that would be recognized as revenge porn today, but in 1963 there was no such concept. Ian's theft of the photographs and his use of them in court was considered perfectly acceptable evidence gathering. The press speculated endlessly about the identity of the headless man in the photographs. The mystery became a national obsession. Was it Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the Hollywood actor who'd been linked to Margaret in the past? Was it Duncan Sandys, the Minister of Defense and Winston Churchill's son-in-law, who reportedly offered to resign from the Conservative cabinet over the scandal when rumors began to swirl? Was it Sigismund von Braun, a former Nazi who'd somehow entered Margaret's social circle? Was it someone else entirely, someone whose name had never been mentioned? The speculation was endless, and the mystery was never officially solved, though many people over the years claimed to know the truth. Margaret refused to identify any of the men in the photographs. Some assumed this was purely to protect her own reputation, to maintain some shred of dignity by not confirming the specifics of her affairs. But there was another, more honorable reason. Many of the men on Ian's list of 88 suspected lovers were closeted gay men. Homosexuality was still illegal in Britain in 1963. If Margaret confirmed or denied affairs with these men on those grounds, she would be exposing their illegal secret and destroying their lives. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the public humiliation she was enduring, Margaret kept quiet to protect them. The court did not thank her for her silence or recognize it as a kindness. Instead, her refusal to cooperate was seen as further evidence of her guilt and defiance. The judge presiding over the case was Lord Wheatley, a particularly conservative man even by the standards of 1963 Britain. When he granted the Duke his divorce, he did so with extraordinary cruelty. His judgment ran to 64,000 words and condemned Margaret in the harshest possible terms. He called her a completely promiscuous woman and wholly immoral. He said she had ceased to be satisfied with normal relations and described her as having a debased sexual appetite. The judgment was a character assassination delivered from the bench. The press had a field day. Margaret became known as the Dirty Duchess, a name that would stick to her for the rest of her life. Her friends abandoned her. Her daughter Frances, who was devoutly Catholic, was estranged from her for many years. Even Margaret's beloved father, George, who had always doted on her, married his mistress shortly after Margaret's mother, Helen, died, and became less involved in Margaret's life. The scandal destroyed Margaret financially and socially. The money that hadn't been spent by Ian during their marriage disappeared in legal fees. The divorce case had been ruinously expensive. Margaret found herself in a position she'd never experienced before. She needed money. In the 1970s, ever resourceful, Margaret began offering tours of her house at Upper Grosvenor Street. For £7.50, visitors could take a tour led by Margaret's butler and enjoy a glass of champagne. The venture didn't take off as she'd hoped. When she could no longer afford to maintain the house, she had to sell it. It was a crushing blow. Upper Grosvenor Street had been her home for decades. Margaret struck a deal to live at the Grosvenor House Hotel, where she also entertained paying guests. For £15 and 95 pence, visitors could have tea and a glass of Buck's Fizz with the infamous Duchess. She also wrote a gossip column for Tatler magazine called Stepping Out with Margaret Argyle. The column was short-lived, not least because Margaret's inability to spell names correctly caused problems with the publication. In 1975, Margaret published her memoir, Forget Not. Critics slated it for excessive name-dropping and a lack of introspection. Margaret remained defiant throughout, insisting that she'd been treated unjustly. She compared the situation to Oscar Wilde's persecution 70 years earlier, saying that, like Wilde, she refused to quietly go away in the face of what she saw as injustice. She was right that her husband had used what we would now call revenge porn against her, but 1960s Britain wasn't ready to see it that way. Margaret continued to live beyond her means for years. In 1978, she moved to an apartment at the Grosvenor House Hotel, but by 1990, she was evicted for failing to pay her hotel bills. She'd run out of options and out of money. Her family and her first husband, Charles Sweeney, rallied around her and put her up in an apartment, but eventually Margaret needed more care than they could provide. She was placed in a nursing home in Pimlico, London. Margaret Campbell, Duchess of Argyll, died on July 25, 1993, after a fall in the nursing home. She was 80 years old. She died in penury, a far cry from the wealth and glamour she'd known for most of her life. Her children buried her with their father, Charles Sweeney, in Brookwood Cemetery in Woking, Surrey. She never remarried after her divorce from Ian Campbell. Ian Campbell, the 11th Duke of Argyll, died in 1973, 20 years before Margaret. He never had to face the same public condemnation she did. His behavior during the marriage and the divorce was seen as somehow more acceptable because he was a man. The double standard was stark. Margaret's story has been revisited multiple times since her death. In 1994, Charles Castle published The Duchess Who Dared: The Life of Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, a biography Margaret herself had commissioned before her death. In 1995, a chamber opera called Powder Her Face, based on major events in Margaret's life, premiered at the Cheltenham Music Festival. The composer Thomas Adès wrote the music, and novelist Philip Hensher contributed the libretto. In 2021, the BBC and Amazon Studios produced A Very British Scandal, a three-part miniseries dramatizing the divorce case. Claire Foy starred as Margaret, and Paul Bettany played Ian Campbell. The series brought renewed attention to Margaret's story and sparked conversations about how differently she might have been treated today. Modern audiences looking back at the case can see clearly what 1960s Britain couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Margaret was subjected to revenge porn before the term existed. Her private photographs were stolen and weaponized against her in court. Her sexual behavior was scrutinized and condemned in ways that her husband's never was. The judge's language in his ruling was gratuitously cruel, designed to humiliate rather than simply grant a divorce. The case also highlighted the intense misogyny of the era. Ian Campbell was known to be violent, abusive, and unfaithful, but none of that mattered. Margaret's affairs were evidence of her moral depravity. Ian's affairs were barely mentioned. When Margaret tried to fight back by questioning the legitimacy of Ian's children, she was condemned for it. When Ian broke into her belongings and stole her photographs, he was praised for exposing her sins. Margaret herself was far from perfect. She was vain, she was spoiled, and she could be thoughtless. She once told Paul Getty to his face that he was a bad father. She was obsessed with class and appearances. She famously said that the essential things in life were always a poodle, only a poodle, that, and 3 strands of pearls. She described herself as always vain, and lamented that nobody had real style or class anymore. She was not in many respects a particularly likable person. But she didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does. The punishment far exceeded any possible crime. Margaret's sexual behavior may have been unconventional for the time, but it was her own business. The photographs were private. Ian had no right to steal them and no right to use them to destroy her reputation. The judge had no right to condemn her with such vicious language, and the public had no right to treat her like entertainment, consuming every detail of her humiliation with gleeful fascination. Margaret Campbell lived for 30 more years after the divorce, but she never truly recovered from the scandal. She remained notorious, forever the Dirty Duchess in the public imagination. The woman who had once been named Debutante of the Year, who had been mentioned in Cole Porter's songs, who had been on every best-dressed list and invited every party, ended her days alone in a nursing home, penniless and forgotten by most of the world. Her story is a reminder of how quickly fortunes can change and how brutally society can turn on women who refuse to conform. Margaret spent her whole life trying to be perfect, trying to be on top, trying to maintain the image her mother had demanded. In the end, it was her very attempts to live boldly and freely that destroyed her. If you enjoyed learning about Margaret Campbell's remarkable and tragic story, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from history. Share your thoughts about Margaret in the comments below. Thanks for watching.